Well, hi everyone. Try to stand a little bit aside. Thank you for organizing the conference and thank you for having me. This will be probably a bit more boring than the keybook. Oh, so I wrote a PhD thesis that dealt with the perception of coherence in typeface design. And by coherence, I mean the unifying style of different characters. I'm going to use the word characters instead of letters for numerous reasons. That sort of binds them together and creates the feeling of a typeface. Some people call it type spirit, or people call it style, or font style, you could call that. What's important, it was focused on perception by the readers. Which brings me to another point. When I say writing, I'm really referring to the artifact. Although I will be talking about processes of producing characters, when I say writing, I really mean the artifact, not handwriting, not content production, nothing like that. Yep. So the approach I took abstracted away from the materiality, so I could study the perception of the individual forms. And then the reason for that was naturally because the different letter forms were different people would see them differently. And then I realized, well, that this could be useful for studies such as many of yours, which deal a lot with materiality. So I'll mention some words from some colleagues. This is a work of Delia Prete from l'Atelier National de la Recherche Typographique in Nancy. And she's a type designer and worked with the Sigillat project on seals, digitizing seals. I think this second slide is much more informative. So in a way, in some way, she's dealing with a lot of different material representations of certain characters. And she's proposing some basic structure, morphology, to represent them digitally in a way that it would be clear that it's this character. However, she also dialed it a little bit back and did some sort of semi-imitative letter forms to suggest in the typeface, in the digital typeface, when then presented on screen or in paper, that it comes from the context of seals. What I would like to call this is maybe a visual decipherment. You can come up with something better, which is the process where type designers often do this, as you will see in the next example. When we look at the material, at the printouts, and we decide, or we try to figure out what is the effect of a material, what is the effect of style, let's say embellishments, what's the ornamental, and what is the essential, which becomes really important when you're studying scripts that are not quite encoded, that are somehow unfamiliar. INFT has an ongoing project called Missing Scripts. That's a collaboration of the University of Berkeley and their scripts encoding initiative, University of Mainz, I think it's university, and INFT, where the students there developed new typefaces. In a similar way, Delia did for the seals, they would do it for scripts that are not yet encoded or that are about to be encoded in Unicode. Another case is work by my friend Riccardo Oloco. This was from his PhD thesis at the University of Reading, where it's just to show that it's a problem we deal with today as well, that there are so many different material versions of, let's say, the letter A, even though it comes from the same typeface, or we might think it comes forms from the same typeface. It could have been produced from different bunches, different types, but it's different papers, different parts of a book produces different letter forms. So how are you going to study something that's actually so varied, so diverse? And I will start with a little bit of terminology. This is how linguistics usually see it. There is some kind of grapheme connected to the sound, and it's mapped onto the graph, which I think usually is meant to be the material thing. So there's a multitude of them. And the only way to say that the graph is a letter A is by knowing it's a letter A. So there's this strange loop going on there. What's interesting, unlike the Megaritz picture, is the letter A is not representation of anything visual. So the letter A corresponds to something abstract. I would like to say we don't know exactly how that looks. Linguists would probably say, oh, it's a phoneme or it's a syllable, but I'm not so sure. The way I think about it, and we can criticize that later, happily, is that there is a bunch of character images, which when we perceive them, become internal representations in our mind. Those I would call character shapes. Think about, seeing rectangle around. Those are different images, different colors, but yet we see it as a rectangle. We have a name for it. And in the same way, we have some sort of notion of a character A that is actually independent of its phonetic value. We could use it in numerous ways. We could use it to represent A, we could even use it to represent a number. So I would like to introduce a little thing called character concept, which you can imagine as something like a glyph from a font. That's some kind of representation of a larger group of images. So yeah, that. So that's it's a term of production. So the font as glyphs produce character images we perceive as character shapes. Just the reason why I'm spending time on this is that I found that different fields have different terminologies, and these different terminologies naturally have sensitivities to the field in particular, but not to the other fields. So I'm trying to combine psychology, linguistics, and visual communication, and I'm based on visual communication. If I forgot something, I'll continue later. So then we could think about these entities as a system, which then is a script. I'm using script as distinct from writing system. Writing system is the way a language uses particular script. The script is a system, visual system of its own. If that makes sense. For example, writing system could be an alphabet. A script is the Latin script. Yeah, so we could take that repertoire of shapes or repertoire of characters and use it for something completely different. Then it would be a different writing system using the same script. This is Devanagari. There was supposed to be some kind of title. What else could I say about this? There is interesting thing here that there is some sort of set of steps from more general to most specific. So by studying the specific, we can start saying or learning things about the more general. So by studying individual character images, we can start learning something about the general characters independently of their meaning, independently of their phonetic value, which is kind of my point here, to study the script as a visual system of its own, which is only, let's say, coincidentally appropriated by language for communication. Character recognition can be seen as a form of specialized form of object recognition. And it's striking how flexible we are. How we can see characters or objects in different lighting conditions, whether at different angle, different perspective, different scale, different position, we still recognize them as particular character. Of course, sometimes it starts to break up, such as the bottom right A. I'm not so sure the next version of it would be actually legible. So a good way to looking at character recognition, which is assigning the identity to a character, is looking at probabilities. We read and we recognize character with certain probabilities, but sometimes we're not so sure. So the context of, let's say, from higher level has to be used to confirm those identities, such as in this case, where the same shape functions as two different characters. Same image. No, not the same image, same shape. So this is from Stephen Palmer, Vision Science. Psychologists, when they studied in the past characters, they would come up with models that would present characters and as individual entities, which for me is problematic because I want to study the relationships, so that's not very informative. The idea of similarity was expressed by overlaying characters. This is actually not from psychology book, it's from typographic book, typographical printing surfaces. But it shows the idea that there is some kind of template for each character. That so instead of phoneme now, we have some sort of idea of a template. That single template can explain all the material complexity, and thanks to the template, we can recognize characters. This is another form of template, which is classic. We all think that works, but it doesn't. It's a topological one, or we could say chirographic one, that we draw a letter from sticks and say this is an A, and it defines all the A's in the world. I'm sticking with the Latin script, but the notion would work across most scripts in the world, and I'll show some examples for other scripts too. Palmer shows that this is another way of illustrating the template. This is for a rectangle, and it shows sort of the problems there. It's been the template approach has been criticized exactly for this, that it doesn't explain invariance towards transformations. And here, example. It's also kind of ineffective if you think in terms of computation. Each letter would need to run through all the characters from character detectors from particular script in our brain. So you need to be extremely fast and always check all these characters, whether they're all these images, whether they are these characters. So, computational time, I don't know. And another criticism of this approach was done by Douglas Hofstadter, who created this grid of all varieties of A, and essentially said, look, this is just a small sample of all the possible A's we can recognize. If you create a parametric description or a topological description, I'm going to be always, he uses Gödel's theorem of incompleteness for this, and I'm going to be always able to come up with yet another A that does not fit the description. So we need to try to find a bit more general approaches. One of these approaches accepted or used by psychological researchers recently is hierarchical, where letter forms are built of features or characters or character concepts. Modeling what's happening in our brain, the eye are made of visual features. So the idea is that you see a character image, it activates a bunch of features that might also activate other letters, but the most successful one is selected. Yeah, and you can see how that's much more effective than running through all of them individually in terms of computation. Not that we are computers, but kind of. So it seems much more viable. These kind of approaches have been also, so what I'm talking about here is recognition. We see a character, we identify it. What I am interested in is character similarity. That might be a bit different, but also features have been used to describe character similarity. For example, Amos Tversky wrote a famous paper, The Features of Similarity. And that's kind of the approach I took to study similarity. So there is reasonable overlap, but still one should keep in mind that features of recognition might not be features of similarity. Usually an outcome of a study with participants of some experiments is a bunch of data that is then processed through some mathematical methods such as multi-dimensional scaling or independent factor analysis to produce maybe these kind of diagrams, and then you see some kind of clusters, and then the scientist comes and says, ha, you see, this must have some kind of same feature, and then they describe that feature in their own terms. They don't ask type designers. So I thought, first of all, this is a problem that, right, we find something and then we still interpret it afterwards. So that might introduce some kind of bias. And of course, I already said that maybe there is actual literature and there is a craft knowledge we could look at. And that's a typography craft knowledge. So I'll spend little time talking about this. This is in Czech, but you know, maybe you've seen these diagrams. They describe letter forms in terms of anatomy. And what's interesting about them is they describe letter forms as made of parts. See, I said I will be not using letters, and but for Latin, that's fine. And interestingly, there are parts that might be rotated or moved, but they are still recognized as the same thing. So that suggests maybe this is some kind of visual feature that could be used to perhaps create a model based on typographic knowledge, and then test this model against the data rather than use it to interpret the data afterwards. So that's what I'm trying to get at. This is a production system called ABCDFG or something like that by Deborah Adams, developed at MIT. Together, I think they wrote a couple of papers together with Richard Southall, who is a major figure in the typographic context, talking about exactly the difference between the, let's say, what I call the character concepts and character images. This is another parametric system to produce letter forms by Hu and Hersh from Lausanne. I think it's CPF page, but in this particular paper, they actually don't give it the name. And later paper, another researcher called it that. And you can see it combines all sorts of qualitatively different parts, which I'll get into. So, this is supposed to be with a gray background. What type designers typically do is they use one technology for production, but they notionally think about the letter forms in a different way. How much time do I have?
You've got about 10 more minutes.
Oh, good. That's so what I'm trying to show with this image is that you might look at the same shape or same image and interpret it in a different way. So, and it doesn't really matter how that shape was made. But so that's what type designers typically do. They would use one technology, for example, based on contours. And while doing that, they would notionally think about what the forms they are producing in terms of strokes. So this is one image made of 4 smaller ones, identical. This is one from 3 different ones. This is let's say a brush stroke from top to bottom. That's brush stroke left to right, right to left. They all would produce vertical rectangle. If we had a gray background. So again, but it's kind of nicer without the gray background.
You can just about see it on the screen,
Oh, yeah.
but it doesn't make it to the big screen.
So the gray background is supposed to be the image we see produced through different concepts, through different descriptions. So the top one is what I would call a contour-based, the bottom one is what I would call stroke-based. Contour-based, the idea is simple. You describe the contour in terms of Bezier curves, and then you fill in the contours. That's a classic. It's been used in all contemporary vector-based graphic systems, and it's the one used by most font developers today in their software. The stroke-based one is also classic. It's been used by most famously by Metafont, but then extended because it has sort of I'll get into the visual later. There's a precedent for this. This is from Edward Johnson's writing and illuminating and lettering. And you can see that what he's suggesting, and there are plenty of writing manuals about this, with also for different scripts and so on, that they describe characters in terms of sequences of strokes that need to be made to produce that particular character. And that metaphor is really useful because from a type design perspective, because you can change a tool but maintain the sequence and movements, and you produce the different letter forms. You can change maybe the width of the stroke structure, and then you change the letter forms. So you can individually address different aspects of the letter form, and the effect is immediately global. Whereas if I had everything drawn as contours, I would need to go and redraw all the individual contours. That's just you could think of these as another kind of topological templates for character production. Yeah. And some Devanagari. This is Charles Wilkins' analysis of the Bengali type from Naik's typography of Devanagari, but it's no, it's actually Devanagari. Sorry. Sorry. Charles Wilkins is famous for making excellent Bengali type, so got confused there. And this is Meta font as visualized by Yanis Haralambous. Well, then few people came and criticized this approach. And I want to mention an older paper. This is from Douglas Hofstadter, Letter Spirit Project, and his students. But there is an older paper by Blesser, Shillman, Cox, Kuklinski, Ventura, and Eden from 1973, where they explored something similar, which they would call, how would they call it? I'll find it out later. Douglas Hofstadter calls it a role. So he talks about, yeah, well, we might be describing letter forms exactly, but sometimes, you know, and that's too limiting. And it's better to talk in terms of roles, which are sets of norms that need to be satisfied in order for that character to be recognized as that character. So it's a bit complicated. I'll switch to an example. So I mentioned that there is one role here, one role here, and one role here. And the middle role is general enough, so it can be satisfied with a straight bar, wavy bar, or a dot, and it still functions as that part of that character and helps us to recognize the letter A. I think it's a brilliant and extremely effective way to dealing with the variety. So you have some sort of literal descriptions, which are shapes or parts of shapes, and then you have a bit more abstract, but not overly abstract descriptions, which are the roles. And even more abstract are things like things that are used in typographic classifications, typographic attributes, and these kind of things. So I looked at this and came up with a relatively simple system. These things are also defined somewhere verbally, but to visualize, this is from my model and my analysis. So I would go through a lot of typefaces. I studied altogether 29 typefaces. Some of them for the Latin script, some of them for the Cyrillic script, some of them for the Devanagari, and used these as I call them parts. Those are the literal shapes, at the lowest level. Then there are some things that are derived from combinations of parts. Those are the roles. That's one kind of role. So role is also useful in terms of dealing with the problem of not seeing the forest for the trees or vice versa. So if we take a letter form and divide it into parts, we might miss something, some sort of holistic attribute. So I use roles in my system to make sure that these things are preserved. So for example, if I would divide D, then the notion of bowl or a closed encounter would be missing. So I use it there. Then there are a few more roles. I feel like I've lost most of you. So I'll go into this. So this is these are diagrams that everything that starts with R underscore is a role. And this is how the model is visualized. But in principle, it's really just features, list of features. This could be there. This could be in that character. So this is for Latin. There's a legend. So for example, circular or bulbous terminals over there and here, even though they're geometrically, strictly speaking, different, they are considered perceptually same. That's the core idea here. Then any stroke that's not straight is a curve. Yeah. And here is the Devanagari. I did a lot of these, and I applied them on different typefaces that I studied. And then what you can do is you can look at a particular character image, say, okay, this concept corresponds to it, and then you can compare these two character concepts in terms of their features. And features can be, of course, they can have different salience. So maybe a shorter stroke, maybe, might have a smaller salience than a longer stroke. But it's simple. Then you compare them, and it gives you some kind of number. And you can do all sorts of things with numbers. For example, say that these two are similar enough, a lot, so on. There was something else I wanted to say, but so
Got a couple of minutes left.
that's perfect. We'll do a test. I needed the data, right? So far, I talked about theory, how I might analyze things and how people look at things, but how do readers look at things? So I created this study. Again, there are some lines missing, so there are 3 squares there. It will be visible a little bit better. And I'll ask, and selected some representative characters. How these were selected, we can discuss at a lunch break. So these were the typefaces I was interested in. I focused on lowercase for Latin and Cyrillic because that's the one we use the most. And for Devanagari, just a basic set. I didn't go into complex syllables. So now exercise. Instead of click, you will shout. Which of the characters is the odd one out? Just judging by visual similarity.
Z.
Correct. But the thing is it's supposed to be correct. Like we have different perceptions. So I would agree with you, or I read your mind.
H.
Some people are waiting with their response.
I just said M.
Okay, good. And now,
I.
sometimes you get a set of characters that are kind of incomparable. So that's really interesting that the relationships don't cross the whole repertoire of the characters. Sometimes they just cross part of it, and those are easy to compare. And sometimes you kind of need to navigate it and come up with more complex ideas. So what you did here is what a lot of people, I forgot the numbers. They're great. They're very impressive. And some couple of hundred people did online, and I collected over 100,000 responses. The response being one choice from this task with the triplet, and then I used the data to. Well, this is how the data would look, right? I call the one you would eliminate the overall odd one out. That's if I asked, for example, 50 people, then the overall odd one out would be the one most eliminated. And then these numbers are normalized, so they add up to 1. And that already tells me something. But I think one should not forget about the small numbers here, or more here. Perception is, like weather, a little bit uncertain, or a little bit imperfect. So here is an example of the data I've collected. The first columns. So the first one is, let's say, the name of the character. Then there's the character image or something like that, or sample. Then there's a count of how people actually responded, and normalized frequencies and confidence intervals for 1,568 triplets. So
We're gonna need to be wrapping up now, we're running out of time.
right.
Okay.
So you can produce similarity matrices where the number tells you this, but it's sort of reductive. It really shows you the relationship of two characters. And the relationship can change, as we've seen, depending on the third character. So what you can also do is compare different typefaces. So this kind of test is able to detect differences in typefaces, which often recognition studies don't really care about. They study just one font or one script. So what I did is I trained the model, meaning I learned on part of the data, I learned the saliences of the features, basically what of those features I chose are important for the readers. That's a form of machine learning I will not go into, but we can find it in the upcoming paper. And then on the other part of the data, I tested how accurate the model is. And it turns out it's quite accurate. So it seems that type designers perhaps know a little bit about what they are doing. And that was part of the goal of the study to maybe emancipate that field rather than as a craft or maybe as a group of people who have some notion about perception, and perhaps psychologists could maybe talk to them rather than maybe study them. So I can go into details later. Then this is how the model, you see the model sometimes gets it wrong. So that's a comparison of the perception, and the pink is what the model would have predicted. But you can do more. You can actually look at the triplet. So Dij. So I can ask, how would the question go? If D and J are similar in the context of I, why? And basically these are the features and their saliences and their contribution to the perceived similarity relationship between characters. The black ones are from the third letter, or from the third character, and they kind of count. Well, they do help the similarity. They, if the third one is different, so that's that. And then it works for Devanagari as well. Although, as you might have seen, the numbers were a little bit lower. So the reason I did this is because I like precision, and I thought maybe this could be this is the way to study perception of coherence, and maybe this could inform type design, and also the other way around. It could help psychology studies be informed by typeface design and typography. But it turns out, I think this could be useful in studies of in epigraphy, paleography, anywhere where basically you cannot just rely on precise geometric descriptions and using precise or geometric sense of similarity and calculating that. So perhaps you could look at the features and talk about characters in terms of their position of the in the system based on similarity relationships. It also describes scripts as visual systems, which might be seen as, independent of linguistics, which I think is one of the points on your agenda. So perhaps that could be useful.
I think we might have to stop up there. Or time for the
That's
next
it.
speaker. Okay.